The man who shuffled through the ornate brass doors of the Gilded Lyre was an affront to its very existence. In a world of starched linen and hushed reverence for wealth, he was a smudge of grit, a discordant note in a symphony of opulence. He wore a coat that looked like it had lost a war with a tractor, its wool frayed and stained with something that might have been oil or mud or both. His boots, heavy and cracked, left faint, ghostly prints of dust on the Italian marble floor, each one an act of sacrilege. The lunchtime clientele, a curated collection of Boston's old money and new tech titans, fell silent. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A woman in a Chanel suit physically recoiled, pulling her alligator skin handbag closer. The maître d', a man named Arthur Finch, who moved with the reptilian grace of a lizard in a custom-tailored suit, froze mid-smirk. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the intruder from head to toe, and a sneer of profound disgust curled his lip. He saw a bum, a vagrant, a problem to be disposed of with maximum prejudice and minimal contact. But Finch, and everyone else in that sun-drenched dining room, was making a catastrophic error in judgment. They saw only the dirt and the torn fabric. They missed the story etched in the man's face, the history carried in the stoop of his broad shoulders. Only one person saw something more. Clara Mayhew, a waitress whose own life felt as worn and frayed as the stranger's coat, felt a flicker of something other than contempt. She was the only one in that entire gilded cage who could understand the guttural, desperate words he began to whisper to himself. And when the time came for her to speak, the truth she unearthed would not merely silence the room. It would shatter the foundation of the Gilded Lyre and change the course of her life forever. You will not believe the secret this man had carried for over half a century. The Gilded Lyre was not merely a restaurant. It was a Boston institution, a fortress of culinary snobbery perched on the most expensive piece of real estate in Beacon Hill. Its windows, vast panes of leaded glass, looked out over the public garden, but its patrons rarely looked outside. Their world was contained within the mahogany-paneled walls, under the soft glow of Tiffany lamps that cost more than Clara's entire college debt. Clara adjusted the tight, unforgiving collar of her uniform, a black dress so severe it felt like a mourning shroud. Her feet ached with a deep, pulsating rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her life. It was just past noon, but she'd been up since 5, poring over dense historical texts for her doctoral dissertation before her shift. She was writing about the displacement of cultural artifacts during the Soviet Union's collapse, a topic so niche it felt like another world entirely. A world, she often thought, more real than this one. She caught her reflection in the polished silver of a champagne bucket, tired brown eyes, skin pale from too many hours under library fluorescents, and a quiet determination that she mistook for exhaustion. She looked like a ghost haunting a feast. Table 7's Chardonnay is breathing, Mayhew, not entering a state of eternal rest. Move. The voice was a silken whip, laced with venom. Arthur Finch materialized beside her, his presence sucking the warmth from the air. He smelled of expensive cologne and a faint, cloying scent of self-satisfaction. "Yes, Mr. Finch, right away," Clara murmured, reaching for the bottle. "And for God's sake, try to look like you belong here," he hissed, his voice a low conspiracy meant only for her. "We have the Cabot trustees dining this afternoon. I will not have my establishment's reputation sullied by a moping academic. Your dissertation can wait. My patrons cannot. Is that clear?" "Crystal, sir," she said, her voice betraying none of the fire that licked at her insides. She couldn't afford to lose this job. The tips, when the patrons were feeling generous, were the only thing keeping her and her father afloat. Her dad, a proud Marine, who'd come back from Desert Storm with a chest full of medals and a mind full of ghosts, was losing his battle with a service-related illness. The VA was a labyrinth of paperwork and delays, and the mortgage on their small row house in Dorchester was a hungry beast that was never satisfied. This job, this soul-crushing, humiliating job, was the retaining wall against a flood of debt that threatened to sweep them away. It was then that the revolving doors groaned, and the man entered. The carefully orchestrated symphony of the dining room faltered, the clinking of silver, the murmur of conversation, the soft pop of a cork. It all ceased, replaced by a thick, judgmental silence. He stood there, blinking in the sudden opulence, looking utterly and tragically lost. He wasn't just underdressed, he seemed to be from another time, another planet. His hair was a wild shock of iron grey, his beard untrimmed, and his hands were gnarled and calloused, the hands of a man who had worked with stone or steel his entire life. But it was his eyes that snared Clara's attention from across the room. They were a startling, pale blue, and they weren't scanning the room with menace, but with a deep, aching sense of bewilderment, as if he'd expected to find something here that was long gone. In one hand, he clutched a small, grimy leather pouch, holding it to his chest like a sacred relic. Finch's posture straightened. This was not just a nuisance, it was a performance opportunity. He loved nothing more than demonstrating his absolute authority, especially when the offender was so clearly beneath him. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough for the patrons at the nearest table to hear and nod in agreement. He smoothed his silk tie, a gesture of a general preparing for a swift and brutal campaign, and began his march toward the entrance. His handmade Italian shoes clicked on the marble with the sound of a ticking clock. Clara should have turned away. She should have poured the Chardonnay for table 7. Her father's face flashed in her mind, the worry lines deepening around his eyes. But she couldn't move. There was something in the man's stance, not aggression, but a profound weariness, a defense against a world that had clearly beaten him down for a very long time, that resonated with a painful chord deep inside her. The man took a few shuffling steps toward the maitre d's station. The hostess, a young woman named Tiffany, whose primary qualification was her resemblance to a porcelain doll, suddenly became fascinated by her reservation screen, her face a mask of polite terror. The man spoke, and his voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. It was thick with an accent Clara couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, certainly. He gestured with the leather pouch. "Yashukayu is here. A plate?" The word he used for plate wasn't quite right. It was an archaic term, something she'd read in a historical text about Ukrainian folk art. It could also mean a plaque or a memorial marking. Finch stopped a calculated 3 feet away, creating a sanitary cordon. "I believe you've taken a wrong turn, my good man," he said, his voice a weaponized form of politeness. "The shelters are several blocks south. This is a private dining club." The man blinked, his gaze moving from Finch's shimmering suit to his own filthy coat. He didn't seem to register the insult, or perhaps he had weathered so many that they no longer left a mark. He shook the pouch gently. Nay. The plate. From Lviv. It must be here." A titter of cruel laughter rippled through the room. A man with a pink bow tie whispered to his companion. "He thinks this is an antique shop. Probably wants to trade his coat for a bowl of soup." Finch's smile was thin and sharp. "I can assure you, we have no plates for you. You are disturbing our guests. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." The man's brow furrowed in a mixture of frustration and confusion. He tried again, the English words crumbling under the weight of his accent. My babushka, grandmother. She work here, long time. Said, keep safe. The plate. He was speaking a broken mixture of English and Ukrainian, and that's when it clicked for Clara. The accent, the specific vocabulary. It was a dialect from the western part of the country, near the Polish border. A dialect her own great-grandmother had spoken. He's not even coherent, Finch announced to the room, turning to signal his security guard, a burly ex-bouncer named Frank, who was already moving in from the lobby. Drunk, most likely. Frank, please escort this gentleman out. Use the service exit. I don't want him alarming anyone else on his way out. Frank was a large man, but he looked hesitant. The stranger was old, but he was built like an oak tree, and there was a deep well of sorrow in his eyes that gave Frank pause. Sir, you gotta come with me, Frank said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he reached for the man's elbow. The stranger flinched back, as if he'd been burned. "Nie turhajcie mnie!" he roared, the Ukrainian words echoing off the high ceilings like a thunderclap. "Don't touch me." The sudden volume of his voice sent a shock wave through the room. A woman gasped. Finch took a theatrical step back, his hand flying to his chest. "He's violent. He's unhinged. Frank, restrain him. Someone call 911. Clara watched, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. That wasn't the roar of a madman. It was the cry of a cornered animal, the last desperate shout of someone who had been pushed and prodded and dismissed one too many times. She looked at Finch, preening and posturing for his audience, the valiant protector of the privileged. She looked at the grimy leather pouch clutched in the old man's hand. He was holding on to it as if it contained the last ember of hope in a cold world. In that moment, Clara made a choice. It was a foolish, reckless, career-ending choice that would likely see her and her father out on the street. But she couldn't stand by and watch them treat him like a piece of trash to be swept out the back door. She placed the Chardonnay bottle on a nearby serving stand with a soft, decisive click. "Mayhew," Finch barked, seeing her move from her station. "Get back to your table. This is not your concern." She ignored him. With a steady, determined gait, she walked past the gawking patrons, past her furious manager, and placed herself directly between the advancing security guard and the old, disheveled stranger. She looked up into the man's pale, frightened eyes. He was even more intimidating up close, smelling of damp wool, cold earth, and something vaguely metallic like old tools. He was tensed, ready for a fight. Clara took a slow, calming breath, looked him directly in the eye, and spoke in the language of her ancestors, her voice quiet but clear in the cavernous silence. "Vivi bezpeci. Ja хочу допомогти. Що ви шукаєте?" "You are safe. I want to help. What are you looking for?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The tension drained out of the old man's body as if a plug had been pulled. The fury in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a look of such profound, staggering disbelief that he seemed to sway on his feet. He stared down at the young waitress in her stark black uniform, as if she were a mirage. "Wy rozmawляєте на шою мовою," he whispered, his voice trembling. You speak our language?" "Trochę," Clara replied, keeping her tone gentle. "Moja prababcia nawczyła mnie." "A little. My great-grandmother taught me." Behind her, Arthur Finch was practically vibrating with rage. "What in God's name is the meaning of this, Mayhew? Are you conspiring with this person? Step aside this instant." Clara half-turned, her body still acting as a shield. "He's not a threat, Mr. Finch. He's just lost. He doesn't understand you." "I don't care if he understands Klingon," Finch spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "He is trespassing. He is filthy. And he is ruining the multi-thousand-dollar lunches of my clientele. Tell him to get out, or you can pack your bags and go with him." The old man, seeing the aggression on Finch's face, took a protective step forward, holding the leather pouch out not to the manager, but to Clara. "Bud Laska," he pleaded, his voice soft and desperate. "Dopomogit mene. Please, help me." Clara took the pouch. Her fingers brushed against the worn, supple leather. It was old, very old. She carefully untied the drawstring. The other staff, the patrons, even Finch, leaned in, their curiosity overpowering their disgust. What treasure could this beggar possibly be guarding so fiercely? She tipped the contents into her palm. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was a small, hand-painted wooden plaque, no bigger than her hand. It was a triptych, 3 panels hinged together. The wood was dark with age, and the paint was faded, but the artistry was breathtaking. The central panel depicted a woman with a sorrowful face, wrapped in a blue cloak, holding a single white lily. The side panels were intricately carved with Cyrillic script. "What is that piece of junk?" Finch sneered. "Firewood?" But Clara wasn't listening. She was staring at the artist's signature in the bottom corner of the central panel. It was a tiny, stylized bird. A nightingale. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen that signature before, in textbooks, in museum archives. It was the mark of Ivan Moros, a master iconographer and artisan from the early 20th century, a man whose work was considered a national treasure in Ukraine. Most of his pieces were thought to have been lost or destroyed during the purges. An authenticated Moros triptych would be worth... She couldn't even fathom the number. "He says he's looking for its pair," Clara said, her mind racing. "He says his grandmother worked here, decades ago. Her name was Oksana. She told him this restaurant was a safe place." "Oksana," Finch scoffed. "We've never employed anyone by that name. We have records going back 50 years. He's delirious. Probably stole that thing from a church donation box." He snapped his fingers at Frank. "That's it. I'm done. Get him out. Now." Frank moved in again. The old man let out a guttural cry of despair and lunged not at Frank, but at Clara, trying to retrieve his treasure. Frank, misinterpreting the move as an attack, grabbed him in a bear hug. "Police!" Finch shrieked, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police. He's assaulting my staff." The dining room erupted. Patrons were getting up from their tables, some filming with their phones. The old man was struggling in Frank's grasp, his eyes wild with betrayal, fixed on Clara. He thought she had tricked him. "Nay!" Clara shouted, holding up the triptych. "Stop! Please, everybody just stop!" She turned to Finch, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "Mr. Finch, give me 5 minutes. That's all I ask. I can get him to leave peacefully. If you call the police, this becomes a media circus." Elderly immigrant assaulted at Boston's premier eatery. "Is that the headline you want the Cabot trustees to read tomorrow morning?" Finch paused. His cruelty was matched only by his vanity and his terror of bad press. He glared at Clara, his eyes promising a world of pain. 5 minutes, he hissed. "Get him out the back. And Mayhew, after he's gone, you come straight to my office. You and I are going to have a final conversation about your employment." The threat barely registered. All that mattered was the terrified man and the priceless artifact in her hand. She turned to him, speaking quickly and calmly in Ukrainian. "Listen to me. They want to hurt you. We have to go somewhere safe. I will help you, I swear it. But we cannot stay here." The man looked from the security guard to the hostile faces of the diners. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the genuine urgency in her eyes, the way she was protecting the triptych with her own body. "Vi doppomoget?" he asked, his voice broken. "You will help?" "Tak," she said firmly. "I will help. Come with me." She didn't lead him to the front door. She guided him past the kitchen toward the service elevator in the back, the one used for hauling trash and linens. The patrons shrank away as they passed, pulling their cashmere and silk from the path of his dirty coat. As the steel doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing them off from the noise and the hate, a heavy silence fell. The only sound was the man's ragged breathing. He leaned his head against the cold metal wall and closed his eyes. "Diakuyu," he murmured. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Clara said, pressing the button for the basement. "First, we get you some water. Then you're going to tell me exactly who you are." She looked down at the wooden triptych in her hand. The sorrowful woman's eyes seemed to stare back at her, sharing a secret across a century of turmoil. Clara's historian's brain was on fire. This wasn't just a lost tourist. This was a living, breathing piece of the history she had only ever read about in books. And something told her that the story of this man and this piece of art was deeply, inextricably linked to the very foundations of the Gilded Lyre. The employee break room in the basement was the restaurant's ugly secret. It was a windowless, cinder-block room that smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaning agents, and quiet desperation. The fluorescent lights hummed with a weary buzz, casting a sickly greenish pallor on the peeling paint and the laminated tables sticky with spilled sugar. It was a world away from the Tiffany lamps upstairs. Clara led the old man to a rickety plastic chair in the corner, away from the curious stares of a few prep cooks taking their break. They whispered behind their hands, but a single sharp look from Clara was enough to silence them. She went to the vending machine, fished out the crumpled dollar bills from her apron, and bought a bottle of water and a packet of crackers. She poured him a cup of coffee from the communal pot, a bitter, tar-like substance that had been stewing for hours. "Here," she said, placing the meager offerings on the table before him. "It's not much." He looked at the food and water as if she had presented him with a feast. He nodded his thanks, his large, gnarled hands fumbling with the cap on the bottle. He drank nearly half of it in a single, desperate pull, his throat working convulsively. Clara sat across from him, placing the Moroz triptych carefully on the table between them. In the harsh, unforgiving light, she could see the full extent of his exhaustion. The lines on his face weren't just wrinkles. They were deep, carved canyons of hardship. His knuckles were swollen, his fingernails rimmed with dirt. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with the earth itself. She waited until he had slowly, methodically, eaten 2 of the crackers. Then she leaned forward, keeping her voice low. "The man upstairs, Mr. Finch, he thinks you are a homeless man, that you are drunk or crazy." The man wiped a few crumbs from his beard with the back of his hand. He looked up, and his pale blue eyes were lucid and piercingly intelligent. "And you? What do you think?" "I think," Clara said, choosing her words carefully, "that you are carrying a museum piece in a leather pouch. I think you speak a very specific Hutsul dialect of Ukrainian. And I think you are on a mission that is far more important than getting a free meal." She gently tapped the wooden triptych. "This is the work of Ivan Moroz. It's a masterpiece. Where did you get it?" A shadow of caution fell over the man's face. It was the guarded look of someone who had learned long ago that trust was a dangerous currency. He took another slow sip of water before he spoke, his English more careful now, as if the small act of kindness had cleared some of the fog of his distress. "It is from my family," he said. "My name is Dmitry Volkov. This triptych and its sister. They were wedding gift to my great-grandparents, made by Moroz himself. He was friend of family. Clara's eyes widened. Volkov? The Volkovs of Kiev? The industrialists? I've read about your family. They were patrons of the arts. They were purged by the Bolsheviks. Their assets were seized, their collections scattered. It was believed the entire family was executed. A bitter, sorrowful smile touched Dmitri's lips. Not all. My grandmother, Oksana. She was just a girl. She escaped with a governess. She had nothing. Only this. He gestured to the triptych. She had to leave the other one, the companion piece, behind. She believed it was lost forever. So how did you get here? To Boston? To this restaurant? Clara pressed, her historian's curiosity now fully ignited. My grandmother came to America, to Boston. She was proud. She did not want charity. She worked, cleaned floors, washed dishes. For many years she worked here, in this building. He looked around the drab basement room as if seeing ghosts. She told me stories. The owner then, a Mr. Abernathy, he was a kind man. He knew her story. He knew she was more than a cleaner. She had a secret, the triptych. She was terrified the Soviets would find her, take it from her. Mr. Abernathy, he offered to hide it for her, a safe place. And the other one? Clara asked, leaning in. The companion piece? Dmitri's eyes clouded over. That is a miracle. After the wall fell, my father went back to Ukraine. He spent his life searching. He found it, hidden in the wall of our old family home. It was being used as a government office. He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He died last year. His final wish, for me to bring the two pieces together, to fulfill my grandmother's dream. He found records, a receipt. Mr. Abernathy had a special safe installed for her. He gave her a plaque, a brass plate, as a marker. The records say it is still here, in this restaurant. Clara felt a dizzying sense of revelation. He wasn't asking for a plate of food. He was asking for a plaque, a marker. Yes, Dmitri nodded. The one I have, it is the martyr, the mother. The one hidden here, it is the detainer, the child. Together, they are hope in winter. My grandmother, she died before my father found the second piece. I am here to finish the story. But why are you dressed like this? Clara asked gently. If your family is the Volkovs, surely you have resources. You could have just made a phone call. Dmitri looked down at his ragged coat. Resources are complicated. My father spent everything on his search. Our name is history, not money. I am a stonemason. I live in a small town in Maine. I saved for a year to make this trip. I came as I am. I did not think it would be like this. He looked up at her, his expression one of raw vulnerability. I thought I would find a kind man, like Mr. Abernathy. Instead, I find him. The break-room door slammed open with a deafening bang. Arthur Finch stood framed in the doorway, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He was not alone. Behind him stood Frank, the security guard, and two uniformed Boston police officers. There he is. Officers, Finch announced, his voice ringing with theatrical indignation. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Dmitri, hiding in my basement with his accomplice. Clara shot to her feet, instinctively moving to stand in front of Dmitri again. Mr. Finch, this is a misunderstanding. He was just explaining. Oh, I'm sure he was, Finch sneered, striding into the room. The other employees scattered like mice. You are fired, Mayhew. Fired. For insubordination, for harboring a trespasser, and for gross dereliction of duty. Clean out your locker. I want you off my property in 10 minutes. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. The mortgage, her father, The room seemed to tilt. "Mr. Finch, please. You don't understand who he is." "I understand that he is a vagrant who does not belong here," Finch cut her off. He then turned his venomous gaze on Dmitri, who had remained seated, watching the scene unfold with a strange, weary calm. "And as for you," Finch said, his eyes falling on the Moroz triptych sitting on the table. His sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of avarice. He might not have known what it was, but it was clearly old and beautifully made. It looked valuable. "Officers," Finch said, his voice taking on a new, graver tone. "I'd like to add another charge." "Theft." Clara gasped. "What? That's his. It belongs to his family." "Don't be an idiot, Mayhew," Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Look at him. He probably pried that off a church wall this morning. It's clearly a valuable antique. He has no business possessing it." He reached a hand out towards the triptych. "I'll just take that as evidence." Dmitri moved with a speed that belied his age and weariness. His hand shot out and clamped down on Finch's wrist. It was not a violent move, but it was one of immense, immovable strength. Finch squeaked, his eyes wide with shock and pain. "That," Dmitri said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "does not belong to you." "He's assaulting me," Finch shrieked. "You saw that. He's resisting arrest. Get it off him." One of the officers, a sergeant with a tired face and a name tag that read Miller, stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "All right, pal. Let him go. Let's not make this any worse than it already is." Dmitri released Finch's wrist, leaving red marks on the pale skin. He stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to fill the small room. He looked not at Finch, but at Sergeant Miller. "Officer," Dmitri said, his English now stripped of its brokenness, each word precise and weighted. "This man is mistaken. I am the legal owner of this artwork. I have come to retrieve the other half of the set, which is stored on these premises." Miller looked skeptical. "You have proof of ownership for that thing." "The proof is not on a piece of paper," Dmitri said calmly. "It is in the history of this establishment. You need to look for the records of a man named Abernathy." "The original owner?" Finch let out a hysterical laugh. "Abernathy? He sold this place to my grandfather in 1968. His records are dust. This is insane. He's a lunatic. Just arrest him and be done with it." But Clara's mind was racing. Abernathy, 1968. Her dissertation work had involved navigating Boston's city archives, property deeds, business licenses. She knew the systems. She knew how to find things that were supposed to be dust. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "He's right. The sale would have included a manifest of all items on the premises, including anything held in trust. It would be in the city registry archives. Finch's grandfather would have legally assumed responsibility for everything in the building." Finch's face went pale. That's ridiculous. It was over 50 years ago." "The law doesn't have a statute of limitations on property held in trust, Mr. Finch," Clara said, the words flowing out of her with the confidence of an expert in her field. "If Mr. Abernathy agreed to hold property for Mr. Volkov's grandmother, that is a fiduciary duty that transfers with the sale of the business. If your family has been in possession of a priceless work of art for 50 years and failed to notify the legal heirs, that's not just theft, that's conversion. The civil penalties alone would be—" She paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "Catastrophic." The entire dynamic in the room shifted. Sergeant Miller looked from the articulate, knowledgeable waitress to the sputtering, suddenly terrified restaurant owner. This was no longer a simple case of a vagrant causing a disturbance. This was complex. This had the stench of old money and buried secrets. "My father is a veteran," Clara continued, pressing her advantage, her voice shaking slightly but firm. His name is Sergeant Thomas Mayhew, USMC, retired. He taught me that you don't get to judge a person by their coat. You judge them by their honor. This man, she said, gesturing to Dmitri, came here with honor to reclaim his family's legacy. And you, she turned to Finch, tried to have him thrown in jail because you didn't like his boots. Dmitri looked at Clara, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow appeared in his eyes. It was awe. Sergeant Miller made a decision. He was no art historian, but he was a good cop, and he knew a bully when he saw one. He also knew when a situation was spiraling far above his pay grade. He turned to Finch. Mr. Finch, I think it's best if everyone just calms down. We are not going to arrest this man right now. What? Finch shrieked. This is my restaurant. I want him out. And I, said a new voice from the doorway, want to know what all the commotion is about. An elderly man in a perfectly tailored tweed jacket stood in the doorway. He had a kind, intelligent face and walked with the aid of a silver-handled cane. The patrons upstairs would have recognized him instantly. He was Judge Harrison Cabot, the patriarch of the Cabot family and a trustee of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. He was table 7. Judge Cabot, Finch stammered, his face draining of all color. I am so sorry for this disturbance. We were just removing a trespasser. Judge Cabot's sharp eyes surveyed the scene. The terrified owner, the calm police officer, the defiant young waitress, and the weary, dignified old man standing beside a piece of art that made the judge's heart skip a beat. He walked slowly into the room, his gaze fixed on the triptych. May I? He asked, his voice soft but commanding, gesturing to the wooden plaque. Clara nodded, her hand trembling as she pushed it gently across the table. The judge picked it up with the reverence of a true connoisseur. He examined the brush strokes, the aged wood, the signature nightingale. He was silent for a full minute. The entire room held its breath. Good heavens, Judge Cabot whispered, looking up at Dmitri. I've only ever seen drawings of this in textbooks. This is the mother of Lviv, an original Ivan Moros. It was thought to be destroyed in 1922. He looked at Finch, his expression now cold as a winter morning. And you were about to have the man who owns it arrested for theft? The silence that followed was the sound of Arthur Finch's world crumbling to dust. The employee break room became an impromptu courtroom, with Judge Cabot presiding from a plastic chair. The authority he carried needed no gavel or bench. It was inherent, woven into the fabric of his being. The prep cooks had been dismissed, and the police officers now stood by the door, no longer as enforcers for Finch, but as witnesses to a history lesson. Finch, slumped in a corner, had gone from apoplectic to ashen. His attempts to bluster and defend himself had been systematically dismantled by the judge's calm, incisive questions. So, Mr. Finch, Judge Cabot said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the law, you maintain that you have no knowledge of any items being held in trust by your family for a former employee named Oksana Volkov? None whatsoever, Finch mumbled, avoiding everyone's gaze. My grandfather was a businessman. If there was no profit in it, he wouldn't have bothered. Profit, the judge repeated, the word tasting like something foul in his mouth. He turned his attention to Clara. Miss Mayhew, you mentioned the city archives. You believe records of the original sale agreement would still exist? I'm certain of it, Your Honor, Clara said, her confidence growing. Property and business transfer documents of that era, especially for a landmark establishment like this, are meticulously preserved. They'd be in the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds, likely on microfilm. The sale agreement would have to include a schedule of assets and liabilities. A trust property would be listed as a liability. The judge nodded, a small, appreciative smile on his lips. A PhD candidate, I presume? History? Yes, sir. Soviet-era cultural history. I thought so. You have a good head on your shoulders, young lady. He then looked at Dmitri. Mr. Volkov, your grandmother, Oksana. Did she ever describe where in the restaurant Mr. Abernathy secured the second triptych? Dmitri closed his eyes, summoning a memory from a distant childhood. She said he made a special place, a place of honor, but hidden, behind stone, near warmth. She said he gave her a key and a small brass plaque, a marker engraved with a nightingale, just like the signature. She had to leave the key and the plaque behind when she had to move to a nursing home. Behind stone, near warmth, Clara murmured, her mind picturing the layout of the restaurant. The main dining room had a massive, floor-to-ceiling granite fireplace, a centerpiece that hadn't been used in decades, but was maintained for its aesthetic grandeur. The fireplace, she said aloud. Finch scoffed, a last gasp of his former arrogance. That fireplace is solid granite. It's a decorative facade. There's nothing behind it but brick and mortar. Perhaps, Judge Cabot said, his eyes twinkling. But Mr. Abernathy was known for his eccentricities. He was a contemporary of Isabella Stewart Gardner. That generation loved secret panels and hidden compartments. He stood up, leaning on his cane. I believe it's time for a little exploratory architecture. Sergeant Miller, would you be so kind as to accompany us upstairs? And Mr. Finch, he added, his voice hardening, you will come too. I want you to watch. The procession back up to the main dining room was a surreal spectacle. The judge, the stonemason, the waitress, the disgraced owner, and 2 police officers marched through the now empty restaurant. The lunch patrons had been politely but firmly asked to conclude their meals, the disruption blamed on a minor facility issue. They gathered before the great granite fireplace. It was an imposing structure, dark and ornate, carved with grapevines and gargoyles. Clara ran her hands over the cool stone, searching for a seam, a joint, anything that looked out of place. It would be near the bottom, Dmitri said, his voice a low rumble, so she could reach it. He knelt down, his stonemason's hands reading the stone in a way no one else could. He tapped and listened, his head cocked. He ran his fingers along the mortar lines. Then he stopped. Here, he whispered. He pointed to a single square block of granite to the right of the hearth, about 2 feet from the floor. It looked identical to all the others. This one is different. The mortar is newer. Not by much. Maybe 50, 60 years. Finch rolled his eyes. This is a farce. Dmitri ignored him. He took a small, sturdy-looking pocket knife from his coat. He carefully worked the tip into the hairline crack of the mortar. With a surgeon's precision, he scraped away the old material. Then he pressed his palms flat against the block and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of stone grinding on stone, the block receded an inch into the wall. A collective gasp went through the small group. Dmitri reached into the opening and pulled. The granite block, surprisingly light for its size, swung inward on a hidden hinge, revealing a dark, square cavity. And inside, gleaming in the dim light, was a small brass door, like that of a bank deposit box. Embedded in the center of the door was a lock, and just above it, a small tarnished brass plaque. Engraved on the plaque was the delicate, unmistakable image of a nightingale. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. It was real. The whole story was real. Well, I'll be damned, Sergeant Miller muttered. Finch stared, his mouth agape, his face the color of spoiled milk. The key, Dmitri said, his voice thick with emotion. We need the key. My grandfather. He cleaned out Abernathy's old office when he took over. Finch stammered, his mind clearly racing, trying to calculate the trajectory of his ruin. There was an old safe, a box of old keys. I think it's still in the wine cellar. The descent into the wine cellar was a walk of shame for Arthur Finch. He led the way, fumbling with a ring of keys, his confident stride replaced by a defeated shuffle. He opened a heavy oak door into a vast, climate-controlled cavern lined with thousands of bottles of wine, sleeping monuments to forgotten fortunes. In a dusty corner, behind a rack of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, sat a small black iron safe covered in cobwebs. Finch worked the combination, his hands shaking. The safe swung open with a rusty squeal. Inside was a collection of old ledgers and a small, velvet-lined wooden box. He handed the box to Judge Cabot. The judge opened it. It was filled with an assortment of antique keys, each with a yellowed tag. Clara and Dmitri leaned in, scanning the labels. Boiler room, linen closet, attic. And then, at the very bottom, Clara saw it. A small, ornate brass key, different from the others. The tag attached to it had a single word, written in elegant, faded cursive, Nightingale. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she handed the key to Dmitri. His large, calloused fingers, which had seemed so clumsy before, closed around the key with an almost sacred reverence. Back in the dining room, a reverent silence fell as Dmitri approached the fireplace. He inserted the key into the lock on the small brass door. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. He pulled the door open. The interior of the safe was lined with faded red velvet, and resting inside, nestled on the worn fabric, was the second triptych. It was a perfect mirror to the first, depicting a young child wrapped in a golden blanket, reaching for the white lily held by the mother in the companion piece. It was in pristine condition, the colors still vibrant, the wood glowing with a warm inner light. Dmitri reached in and lifted it out. He walked to a large dining table where the first triptych lay. He placed the second one beside it, fitting them together. Hope in Winter was complete for the first time in nearly a century. The two halves formed a single, breathtaking narrative of love, loss, and endurance. The sorrow in the mother's eyes was now answered by the hope in the child's. Dmitri Volkov stood there, staring at his family's legacy, his face a canvas of 100 emotions. Tears traced clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. He had done it. He had finished the story. Judge Cabot placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They're magnificent, Mr. Volkov. Absolutely magnificent." Then the judge's expression hardened as he turned to face Arthur Finch. "And you, sir," he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "You have a great deal to answer for. This is not merely a piece of art. This is property held in a sacred trust. Your family has concealed it, profited from the establishment that housed it, and today you attempted to have its rightful heir arrested. You spat on the honor of your own establishment and the legacy you inherited." Finch began to babble, a pathetic stream of excuses and apologies. "I didn't know. It was my grandfather. I had no idea." "Ignorance is not a defense, Mr. Finch," Judge Cabot cut him off, "especially when it is willful. You had a duty of care, a duty you have spectacularly failed to uphold." He turned to Sergeant Miller. "Officer, I will be filing a formal complaint with the District Attorney's Office in the morning on behalf of Mr. Volkov. I suspect there will be both civil and criminal investigations into the matter of Finch family's stewardship of this restaurant. I would advise you, Mr. Finch, to hire an exceptionally good lawyer." The aftermath was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, methodical demolition. The story, leaked to the Boston Globe by an anonymous source, who happened to be a close friend of Judge Cabot, became a sensation. The tale of the disguised heir, the priceless lost art, and the heroic waitress captivated the city. The Gilded Liar's reputation was shattered overnight. Reservations were cancelled en masse. The Cabot trustees and every other pillar of Boston society blacklisted the establishment. Finch's gilded cage became a very public prison. Within a month, facing financial ruin and a mountain of legal fees, Arthur Finch was forced to sell. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Clara stood outside the locked brass doors of the restaurant, a box containing her few personal belongings in her hands. She had been formally let go, along with the rest of the staff, when the restaurant closed its doors. The future felt terrifyingly uncertain. A sleek black car, the kind she had only ever seen in movies, pulled up to the curb. The back window glided down, revealing Dmitri Volkov. He was no longer the disheveled man from the dining room. He was wearing a simple but well-made dark suit. His hair and beard were neatly trimmed, and the deep weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. He looked, Clara thought, like a king who had finally come home. "Clara Mayhew," he said, his voice warm. "I was hoping I would find you. Please get in." She hesitated, but he gestured to the seat beside him. She got in, the scent of new leather a stark contrast to the bleach and despair of the employee break room. "I wanted to thank you, properly," he said, as the car pulled silently into traffic. "You did more than help me. You saw me. When everyone else saw garbage, you saw a person. You gave me back more than a piece of art. You gave me back a piece of my faith in the world." "I just did what I thought was right," she said quietly. "That is a rarer quality than you might think," he replied. He tapped a file folder that lay on the seat between them. "The sale of the restaurant was finalized this morning. I am the new owner." Clara stared at him, stunned. You bought it?" "It seemed fitting," he said with a small smile. "My grandmother washed floors here. Now my family owns the building. As for the triptychs, they are being loaned to the Museum of Fine Arts to be displayed for everyone to see. That's what art is for." He paused, then turned to her. "The Gilded Liar is dead. I am going to reopen it with a new name, a new philosophy. It will be called Oksana's. It will be a place that values integrity over polish and character over pedigree. But a place like that needs the right person to run it." He slid the file folder over to her. "I am not a restaurant manager, Clara. I am a stonemason. You, however, you have a brilliant mind, a historian's eye for detail and a core of steel. You understand what this place should be." She opened the folder. Inside was a detailed business proposal and a contract. The contract offered her the position of general manager of the new restaurant. The salary listed made her gasp. It was more money than her father had earned in a decade, but it was the clause at the bottom that made her eyes well up. "Furthermore, a fund will be established in the name of Sergeant Thomas Mayhew for the immediate and comprehensive coverage of all his medical and living expenses, and a full scholarship will be provided for the completion of Dr. Clara Mayhew's doctoral studies at the university of her choice." She looked up at him, unable to speak. "My family lost everything because of cruelty and greed," Dmitri said softly. "I have a chance now to build something new. But I cannot do it alone. I need a partner. Someone who knows what is right." 6 months later, the brass doors of the restaurant reopened. The sign above them no longer read "The Gilded Liar." It read Oksana's in elegant, understated script. Inside, the stuffy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. The room was warm and inviting. In the place of honor, over the great granite fireplace, hung not a painting of a dead aristocrat, but a beautiful, framed portrait of a smiling young woman with kind eyes, Oksana Volkov, circa 1950. Clara Mayhew, Dr. Clara Mayhew, stood at the maitre d' station. She wore a simple, elegant blue dress, and she greeted every guest, whether they arrived in a limousine or on foot, with the same genuine warmth. Her father, looking healthier and happier than he had in years, was seated at the best table in the house, talking animatedly with Dmitri Volkov and Judge Cabot. A young couple, clearly students on a rare splurge, hesitated at the door, looking intimidated. "Is there a dress code?" the young man asked nervously. Clara smiled, a real, brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, "there is. You have to be kind, that's it." She led them to their table, her steps light and sure on the polished marble floor. She was no longer a ghost haunting a palace. She was the keeper of a safe harbor, a place built not on gold or pedigree, but on a foundation of decency, a place where a man's worth was measured not by the quality of his coat, but by the content of his character. And in the heart of Boston, a story was now told, a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not hidden behind stone, but are found in a simple act of courage and a single, compassionate voice that dares to speak up in the silence.